Don't expect any respect here. You're still the failure who never finished college. My uncle sneered as I walked into the family reunion. My parents laughed, my sister looked away, and even my brother said, "Just don't embarrass us tonight." 2 hours later, my sister's fiancé casually asked what I did for work, and when he pulled out his phone and looked me up, his face went white. The room fell silent, and suddenly everyone realized exactly who they'd been mocking. I, 32M, just watched my entire family's world collapse in real time. The ballroom smelled like overpriced catering and desperation. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light over tables draped in white linen, and I stood in the doorway wondering why I'd even bothered to show up. Family reunions were supposed to be about connection, but for me they'd always been about endurance. My uncle spotted me first. He was holding a glass of champagne, his face already flushed from drinking, and the moment our eyes met I saw that familiar smirk spread across his features. He didn't even wait for me to fully enter the room before he announced to anyone within earshot that I shouldn't expect any respect here, that I was still the failure who never finished college. His voice carried across the space, loud enough that conversations nearby stuttered and died. I felt every eye turn toward me. My parents were standing near the bar, and instead of defending me or even looking uncomfortable, they laughed. Not nervous laughter, but genuine amusement, like my uncle had just delivered the punchline to a joke they'd all been enjoying for years. My mother actually wiped at her eye, and my father shook his head with this satisfied grin that told me he agreed with every word. My sister was at a table near the center of the room with her fiancé. She looked up when my uncle spoke, and for just a second I thought I saw something like sympathy cross her face. But then she glanced away, studying her champagne glass like it held the secrets of the universe, and I understood that she wasn't going to say anything either. She never did. My brother appeared at my elbow before I could decide whether to leave or push forward. He was wearing an expensive suit, the kind that probably cost more than my first car, and his expression was tight with annoyance. He told me quietly, almost through clenched teeth, that I should just not embarrass them tonight. He said it like I was the problem, like my mere presence was some kind of liability that needed to be managed. I didn't respond. I just walked past him and headed toward the bar, keeping my face neutral even though my chest felt tight. 20 years of this. 20 years of being the punchline, the cautionary tale, the family embarrassment. All because I dropped out of college in my sophomore year to pursue something they didn't understand and couldn't value. The bartender poured me a whiskey without asking, and I took it to a corner table where I could watch the room without being in the center of it. My uncle was still talking, gesturing broadly, probably telling the story about how I'd thrown away a full scholarship to study business, how I'd broken my parents' hearts, how I'd never amounted to anything. Nobody asked me why I left school. Nobody ever asked what I'd been doing for the past decade. They just filled in the blanks themselves, decided I was working some dead-end job, barely scraping by, probably living in a studio apartment and eating ramen every night. And I'd let them believe it because, honestly, what was the point of correcting them? They'd made up their minds about me years ago. I watched my sister laugh at something her fiancé said. He was new to the family, some corporate attorney she'd been dating for 8 months, and this was his first time meeting everyone. He seemed nice enough from what little I'd seen, polite and attentive, the kind of guy parents dream about their daughters bringing home. He kept his hand on the small of her back and smiled at all the right moments. The evening crawled forward. Dinner was served and I sat alone at my corner table, working through overcooked salmon and roasted vegetables while the rest of the family clustered together at the main tables. Every so often someone would glance my way, whisper something to their neighbor, and they'd both chuckle. I was used to it by now, but that didn't make it sting any less. My uncle made a toast about family and success and staying true to your roots. He talked about how proud he was of everyone in the room, how they'd all worked hard and built good lives for themselves. He didn't mention me by name, but the pause he left, the way his eyes skipped over my corner of the room, said everything that needed saying. After dinner, people started mingling again, moving between tables, refreshing drinks, forming little clusters of conversation. I considered leaving early. I'd shown up, I'd endured the obligatory humiliation, and there wasn't anything keeping me here except some stubborn refusal to let them think they'd gotten to me. Then my sister's fiancé appeared at my table. He had that friendly, slightly awkward expression people get when they're trying to do the right thing, and he asked if he could sit down. I gestured at the empty chairs and he settled in across from me, loosening his tie slightly. We made small talk for a few minutes. He asked how I was doing, commented on the venue, mentioned that he was still getting to know everyone. Then he asked what I did for work. It was a casual question, the kind of thing people ask when they're trying to find common ground. But I saw my sister glance over from her conversation, her expression tightening, just slightly. I kept my answer vague. I told him I worked in technology, did some consulting, helped companies with digital strategy. It was technically accurate, but stripped of any details that might mean something. He nodded, interested but not overly curious, and started telling me about his own work in corporate law. Then he paused mid-sentence, and something shifted in his expression. He asked my last name, which he said he hadn't quite caught during introductions. I told him, and I watched as recognition flickered across his features. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen, and I knew exactly what he was doing even before he went still. His face went white, completely pale, like all the blood had drained out of it in an instant. He stared at his phone screen, then looked up at me, then back at his phone. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I took a sip of my whiskey and waited. The moment stretched out, becoming awkward, and I could see my sister starting to notice that something was wrong. She excused herself from her conversation and started walking over, concern evident in her expression. Her fiancé finally found his voice. He asked if I was the same person who'd founded the company that had just been acquired last month in one of the largest tech deals of the year. The one that had been all over the financial news. The one that had made the 30 under 30 list 3 years running before I'd aged out of that demographic. I confirmed that yes, that was me. I kept my tone casual, like we were discussing the weather or sports scores, but I could see the realization spreading across his face like wildfire. My sister reached the table just as her fiancé stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the ambient conversation. Other people were starting to notice now, turning to look at our corner of the room with curious expressions. He told my sister, his voice loud enough to carry, who I actually was, what I'd actually built. He mentioned the acquisition price, a number with enough zeros that it didn't even sound real, and I watched my sister's face go through a rapid succession of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, shock, and then something that might have been horror. The room was going quiet now, conversations dying off as people registered that something significant was happening. My uncle had stopped mid-sentence, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his mouth. My parents were staring at me like they'd never seen me before. My sister's fiancé kept talking, almost babbling now, mentioning awards I'd won, articles that had been written about my company, innovations we'd pioneered in cloud infrastructure and artificial intelligence. He pulled up images on his phone, showing my sister photos from industry conferences where I'd been a keynote speaker, interviews I'd done with major business publications, the announcement of the acquisition that had appeared on every major news site. She looked at the phone, then at me, and asked in a very small voice if this was true. I told her it was. I asked if she wanted to see the acquisition documents, though I said it gently, without malice. She shook her head and sank into a chair, her face pale. By now the entire room was silent and staring. My brother had pushed through the crowd, his expression demanding an explanation, asking what the hell was going on. My sister's fiancé turned to him and explained, his words tumbling over each other, that the family failure they'd all been mocking was actually one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in the country. My brother's face went through the same progression my sister's had. He tried to argue, saying I'd dropped out of college, that I'd never done anything with my life. But my sister's fiancé was pulling up more evidence on his phone, showing him article after article, photo after photo. The truth was undeniable, and it sat in the room like a physical weight. My uncle finally found his voice. He asked why I'd never told anyone, why I'd let them think I was a failure, and there was an edge of accusation in his tone like somehow this was my fault. I set down my whiskey glass and looked at him directly. I told him that I'd tried to tell them, years ago, when my company was first gaining traction. I'd mentioned it at a Christmas dinner, and my father had laughed, said I was delusional, told me to stop making up stories and get a real job. I'd mentioned it again at another gathering, and my mother had patted my hand and told me it was nice that I had hobbies, but I should really think about going back to school. After a while, I'd stopped trying because it became clear that they didn't want to hear about my actual life. They just wanted their narrative about the dropout who'd thrown everything away. My mother stepped forward, her eyes shining with tears, and tried to take my hand. She said she'd had no idea, that if I'd just explained things better they would have understood, that of course they were proud of me. But her words rang hollow because we both knew the truth. They hadn't wanted to understand. They'd wanted a cautionary tale, and I'd been convenient. My father tried a different approach. He said that family was family, that past misunderstandings didn't matter now, that we should focus on the future. He suggested we all sit down together, have a proper conversation, really get to know each other again. But his eyes kept darting to my sister's fiancé, calculating, and I realized he was already thinking about what my money and connections could do for the rest of them. I stood up and told them I was leaving. My sister grabbed my arm and begged me not to go, said we needed to talk, that there was so much to work through. But I gently removed her hand and reminded her that she'd looked away earlier when our uncle was mocking me, that she'd chosen her comfort over my dignity, just like she always had. My brother tried to block my path, saying I was being unreasonable, that I couldn't just drop this bomb and walk away. I told him that I absolutely could, that I'd spent 20 years being reasonable while they treated me like garbage, and I was done. As I walked toward the door, I could hear the room erupting behind me. People were pulling out their phones, searching my name, finding the same articles and announcements my sister's fiancé had discovered. I heard my uncle's voice rising above the others, demanding to know why nobody had bothered to check, why they'd all just assumed. I heard my mother crying and my father trying to calm everyone down. I made it to the parking lot before my sister caught up with me. She was crying, mascara running down her cheeks, and she said she was sorry. She said she should have stood up for me, should have defended me, should have tried to understand what my life was actually like. She said she loved me, and she hoped someday I could forgive her. I told her I believed she was sorry. I believed she felt bad about what had happened. But I also told her that sorry didn't erase 20 years of humiliation and dismissal. That love wasn't just a feeling, it was actions, and her actions had shown me exactly where I ranked in her priorities. She asked what she could do to make it right. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't know if she could. That maybe with time we could rebuild something, but it would have to be from the ground up because the old foundation was rotten. She nodded, still crying, and I left her standing in the parking lot as I drove away. Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since the reunion, and my phone hasn't stopped ringing. I've gotten calls from my parents, my siblings, my uncle, cousins I haven't spoken to in years, and extended family members I barely remember meeting. I've ignored most of them. The ones I did answer followed a predictable pattern. They all started with apologies, moved into explanations for why they'd acted the way they had, and ended with requests. Could I invest in my cousin's startup? Could I introduce my brother to people in the industry? Could I help my uncle's company with their digital transformation? It was almost impressive how quickly they'd pivoted from mockery to opportunism. My sister has been the most persistent. She's called, texted, and even showed up at my office building twice. The second time I agreed to meet her for coffee, mostly because her fiancé had asked me to give her a chance, and I developed a certain respect for him after the reunion. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, and she apologized again, more thoroughly this time. She explained that she'd been scared of becoming the family scapegoat herself, that going along with their treatment of me had felt like survival. She acknowledged that wasn't an excuse, but wanted me to understand the context. I told her I did understand, which was true. But I also told her that understanding didn't mean acceptance, and acceptance didn't mean things would go back to how they were before. She asked what I wanted from her, from any of them, and I realized I didn't have a clear answer. Mostly I just wanted them to leave me alone. Her fiancé, to his credit, has been nothing but professional and respectful. He sent me a private message apologizing for any awkwardness he'd caused at the reunion, even though he'd done nothing wrong. He mentioned that he'd been doing some thinking about family dynamics and toxic relationships, and he wanted me to know that he saw what had happened clearly. That message meant more to me than all my family's apologies combined. My parents have been the most complicated. They've oscillated between grief and anger, sometimes in the same conversation. My mother cries and talks about how she failed me as a parent. My father gets defensive and insists they did the best they could with the information they had. Neither of them seems to grasp that the information was available all along. They just chose not to seek it out. Last week, my father left me a voicemail suggesting we do a joint interview with a business publication, father and son, talking about unconventional paths to success. I deleted it without responding. The audacity of wanting to capitalize on my success after years of denying it existed was almost breathtaking. The truth is, I don't know what comes next with my family. Part of me wants to cut them off completely, to build a life where I'm not constantly reminded of how little they thought of me. But another part recognizes that I'm not entirely blameless either. I could have fought harder to make them see me. I could have shown up with evidence and forced them to acknowledge reality. Instead, I retreated into silence and let the gulf between us grow wider. Maybe that was my own form of self-protection, or maybe it was pride. Either way, I chose isolation over confrontation, and that choice shaped our relationship as much as their dismissiveness did. For now, I'm taking it day by day. I've told my family that I need space, that I'll reach out when and if I'm ready to have real conversations about rebuilding our relationships. Some of them have respected that boundary. Others haven't. I've started blocking numbers when people ignore my requests for distance. My therapist says this is healthy, that setting boundaries is an important part of healing. But it doesn't feel healthy. It feels lonely and sad, and like I'm mourning people who are still alive. I'm mourning the family I wish I'd had, the parents who would have supported me unconventionally, the siblings who would have been proud instead of embarrassed. That family never existed, and accepting that has been harder than any business challenge I've ever faced. But I'm working on it. One day at a time, I'm building a life where my worth isn't determined by their approval, where my success doesn't need their validation to feel real. And honestly, that might be the biggest victory of all.